Case 1. Deborah Glaser. At 8:30 on a March morning in 2025, police officers stood outside a house in Bethlehem Township, Pennsylvania, knocking on a door that no one would open. They had been sent by a family member who was worried about the two people inside, someone who did the one thing available to them, and asked for someone to go and check. They knocked, they called out. Nothing. Eventually, they raised a ladder to a second-floor window, and there they made contact with the man inside. His name was James Christopher Frank, 57 years old. He came down, opened the door, led the officers through his house, and said 6 words that ended any hope the morning still held. "My wife is dead in the bathtub." She had not drowned. She had not died of any natural cause. Deborah Glaser had been killed, and from the moment those officers stepped into that room, there was no question about it. Her injuries told them plainly. So did the objects left behind. And so did her husband, who admitted what he had done, and admitted he had not stopped until he was certain she would not survive. That deliberate making certain is the difference under Pennsylvania law between a killing and murder in the first degree. It is the legal definition of a specific, formed intent to kill, and he had said it out loud. Her name was Deborah Denise Glaser. She was 55. They had married in 2012, 13 years together in that house on 3rd Street. The public record holds very little about her life, but her family, standing in a Northampton County courtroom, gave her back to us. Her father, Stephen Glaser, could not read his own words aloud. A victim advocate read them for him. He spoke of 2 days he would carry forever: the day his daughter was born, the best day he had ever known, and the day she died, the worst. And he said something that may be the truest thing spoken in that courtroom: that he does not know the details of what happened to her, and the details do not matter to him. What matters is that his daughter is gone. Another member of her family, Madeline Glaser, told the court she misses her terribly every day, and described the particular heaviness of moving forward with your own life, knowing Deborah cannot. On June 10, 2026, James Frank pleaded guilty to first-degree murder before Judge Brian J. Pannella. In Pennsylvania, that carries 1 sentence and one only. A week later, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And it was there, at that final hearing, that he offered an explanation for the first time. He told the court it had been a mutual decision, that his wife was suffering from an illness they could not afford to treat, that she had wanted to die, that the two of them meant to be found together, and that he had simply finished what she began. An act, in his telling, not of violence, but of mercy. Prosecutors did not accept it for a moment. First Assistant District Attorney Robert Iyer said his words at sentencing carried no weight whatsoever, and pointed to what Frank had already admitted, to police and in open court, about how he killed his wife. Here is what we find most revealing about that moment, not as a legal finding, but as our own reading of it. That explanation arrived at the very end, not that morning, not during the investigation, not at his guilty plea, but at sentencing, after he had already admitted to a killing that, by definition, required him to have decided to do it. Investigators who work these cases describe the pattern often. When the facts can no longer be changed, the story changes instead. Not to escape the sentence, that was already fixed, but to escape the meaning of it. And notice what that particular story does. It hands the decision to the one person no longer here to answer. It turns an act done to someone into an act done for them. It asks us to believe the only living witness, the man with the most to gain from being believed. The court did not accept it. Her family did not accept it. We leave it to you to weigh what it was worth. And whatever that story was worth, it did not answer the question at the center of this case. Prosecutors never publicly identified a motive. Frank had no prior criminal record and no reported history of domestic violence. 13 years of marriage, and no public warning of how it would end. In many of these killings, the signs are there beforehand, and they are missed, minimized, or hidden by the person being harmed. That is the far more common story, and it is why paying attention saves lives. But no reported history is not the same as nothing ever happened. It means nothing reached the police. What passed inside that house across 13 years is something no case file will ever hold. So the lesson is not the tidy one. The warning we are waiting for may never arrive in a form we recognize. Which is why the most important person in this story is not the man who confessed or the officers who climbed the ladder. It is the family member who picked up a phone that morning and said, "I'm worried about them. Will someone please go and look?" No proof, no history to point to, only a feeling that something was wrong, and they acted on it anyway. So what can any of us actually do when there is nothing to point to? 3 things, and none of them require proof. First, you do not have to be certain. A welfare check is not an accusation, it is a service, and it creates a record where none existed before. Second, don't ask, "Is everything okay?" Someone in trouble will almost always say yes. Instead, give them a way out that costs them nothing. Agree on a single word they can text you. Any hour, that means come and get me. Third, trust the pattern, not the incident. Any one missed call or canceled plan explains itself away. A change in the pattern does not. That is the moment to act, not when you finally have proof. Deborah Denise Glaser deserved a long life, an ordinary spring, and decades more with the father who called her birth the best day of his life. We say her name because that is what remains within our power to give her. And we would like to hear from you. When the signs are entirely invisible, no report, no record, nothing to point to, what is the most effective thing family and friends can actually do for someone they love? And what do you make of a man who waits until the very last moment to offer a reason? Share your thoughts below. Case 2, Nicole Zambrano. On the morning of January 2nd, 2024, a 55-year-old man was eating breakfast at a casino in Las Vegas when police walked up to his table. In his room upstairs, officers found cash spread across the bed, more than $130,000 of it. Investigators believed he was working his way toward the Mexican border. 2,000 miles behind him, in a house on Bearer Avenue in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, his wife had been found the day before. Her name was Franurlis Nicole Zambrano Brasino. Most people knew her as Nicole. She was 26 years old. She had come to Pennsylvania from Venezuela, one of those quiet acts of courage that ordinary life is built on. She worked at Nemacolin, a resort in the Laurel Highlands. She was, by every description, dependable in the most unremarkable and important way. She showed up. She answered messages. She kept in touch. Her husband, Arthur Eugene Goody Jr., was 55. She was 26. Nicole was last seen on December 24th, 2023, Christmas Eve. And then nothing. She did not come to work. She stopped replying. The silence, for anyone who knew her, was immediately and obviously wrong. The Fayette County District Attorney later put it plainly. She was not someone who missed work, and she was not someone who stopped talking to people. That is what saved this case from becoming a disappearance that was never solved. Her absence was noticed within days by people who knew her patterns and refused to explain the silence away. Uniontown Police, State Police, the district attorney said essentially every agency in the county began looking for her. Officers spoke to her husband. He gave them information that was not accurate. He would not come in. So they kept working, tips, forensic evidence, and technology, until on January 1st, 2024, New Year's Day, they had a search warrant for the couple's home. Inside a bedroom, they found Nicole. She had been shot once. The weapon was recovered in another room of the house. By then, Arthur Goody was long gone. Investigators later traced his route. After killing his wife, he drove east into Maryland, where he threw her cell phone away along the side of a road. Then he turned around and drove across the entire country to Las Vegas, checked into a resort, and waited, with $135,000 in cash, and, prosecutors believed, a plan to leave the United States altogether. He never made it. He was arrested at that breakfast table, waived extradition, and came home to Fayette County to stand trial. That trial lasted 4 days in October 2025. The jury deliberated for roughly 90 minutes before convicting him on every count, including murder in the first degree. Judge Mark Mihalov imposed the only sentence Pennsylvania law allows: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nicole's family came for it. They traveled from Venezuela and from across the United States to sit in that courtroom, a room in a small Pennsylvania county filled with people who had crossed a hemisphere for her. The district attorney, speaking afterward, said simply, "May her memory be eternal." Here is our reading of this case, offered as interpretation, not as legal finding. The men in these stories usually build something. A story about an accident, a story about self-defense, a story about a blackout, or a stranger, or a tragic misunderstanding. The story is the attempt to stay in the world afterward, to remain a husband who suffered a loss, rather than a man who committed a murder. Arthur Goody did not build a story. He built a distance. He misled officers just enough to buy hours. He discarded her phone in another state. He crossed an entire country. He carried an amount of cash that requires preparation to assemble, money that does not accumulate in an afternoon. There is a legal concept that fits this exactly: consciousness of guilt. Flight, concealment, disposing of evidence. Courts allow juries to consider these as evidence that a person knew what they had done. And that may be why this jury needed only 90 minutes. His own movements testified against him more clearly than any witness could have. There is one more chapter worth knowing, because it speaks to something important. In 2026, Nicole's estate filed a wrongful death action in Fayette County, invoking Pennsylvania's Slayers Act, a law with a simple and ancient principle behind it: no one may profit from a killing they committed. The cash he carried toward the border is now being claimed on behalf of the woman he left behind. He fled with the money. The law is walking it back to her family. And there is a lesson in this case that costs nothing and saves lives. Nicole was found because she missed work. Not because someone saw violence, not because there was a report on file, because a young woman who always showed up suddenly didn't, and the people around her treated that as the alarm it was, rather than assuming she had simply gone quiet. If someone in your life is reliable and they stop being reliable, that is information. A missed shift from someone who never misses a shift. Unanswered messages from someone who always answers. It feels intrusive to make a call over something so small. It is not intrusive. It is the whole ball game. And if you know someone who lives far from their family, someone whose parents are in another country, whose safety net is thousands of miles away, understand that you may be the closest thing to family they have nearby. The people watching for Nicole were co-workers and neighbors. They were enough. Franurlis Nicole Zambrano Briseno was 26 years old. She crossed a hemisphere to build a life, and it was taken from her before she reached 27. Her family crossed that same distance again, in the other direction, to sit in a courtroom and say her name. We say it here too. And we would like to hear from you. This case had no cover story at all, only flight. Which do you think reveals more about a person, the lie they construct, or the distance they try to put between themselves and what they did? Share your thoughts below. Case 3. Jami Harrison. Before Matthew Harrison killed his wife, he told people he was going to do it. In the days before her death, he sent messages to family members and co-workers making his intent toward Jami clear. To Jami herself, prosecutors would later count more than 120 messages, degrading, threatening, relentless. All of it in writing, all of it before she died. Her name was Jami Harrison. She was 49, originally from Mannheim, Pennsylvania, and the mother of 3 daughters. When those daughters stood up in a Lancaster County courtroom, one of them said the thing that tells you everything. Jami was their only true parent, and Harrison stole that from them. On Monday, February 5, 2024, at the family's home on East Mount Hope Road in Penn Township, Matthew Harrison strangled his wife. The marriage was ending. A man who had learned the relationship was over and who had spent the preceding days telling other people what he intended to do about it. Jami was found later that day by her 11-year-old daughter. Harrison ran east, out of the county, to a motel in Pittston in Luzerne County. 3 days later, the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force found him there. After a brief standoff, he was returned to Lancaster County. And there, he told investigators that his wife had wanted him to do it. That in killing her, he had set her free. On July 23, 2025, before Judge Jeffrey A. Conrad, Harrison pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and strangulation. The agreement dismissed 2 further charges and took the death penalty off the table. Judge Conrad told him he had a duty to love, honor, and protect his wife, and had instead acted with malice and hatred, calling it one of the most cowardly acts a man can commit. The sentence, life without the possibility of parole, plus a further 5 to 10 years, and restitution. Given the chance to explain himself, Harrison declined, saying there was no reason to elaborate. Afterward, he would claim he had not acted out of malice, and that pleading guilty had been an act of courage. One of Jami's daughters had already supplied the more accurate word. She turned, faced him, and called him a coward. Here is our reading of this case, interpretation, not legal finding. Notice that he reached for mercy. In his account, this was not done to Jami but for her. She wanted it. He freed her. That is the second time in this episode we have met that exact reframing, from a different man in a different county, and it is not remorse. It is what a person constructs when the act is undeniable, but the identity is not yet something he will accept. Killing becomes releasing. The woman who can no longer speak is assigned the wish. But this case has what the others did not. A record, made in advance. In threat assessment, there is a term for what Harrison did in those final days: leakage, the tendency of someone planning serious violence to communicate that intention to third parties beforehand. Not to the victim, to friends, relatives, co-workers, people who are not asked to intervene and usually don't. It is one of the most consistently observed warning behaviors in the field. And it happened here, in writing, before. Which brings us to the lesson, and it is urgent. If someone tells you they want to hurt their partner, while drinking, while furious, as a joke they wave off afterward, that is the most direct warning that exists. It will not feel like a crisis. It will feel awkward and exaggerated, and like something you would embarrass yourself by taking literally. Take it literally. You don't have to confront anyone or be certain of anything. You can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline yourself, describe what was said, and let people who do this for a living tell you what your options are. It's free, it's confidential, and you can make that call about someone else's relationship. There is a second warning here that most people don't know. Strangulation is not one violent act among others. Research on intimate partner violence has consistently found that someone who has been strangled by a partner and survived faces a dramatically elevated risk of later being killed by that partner. It is among the strongest predictors we have. If you know someone this has happened to, even once, even years ago, even if they insist it wasn't serious, that is a red flag of the highest order. Jami Harrison was 49, and by her children's own account, the only true parent they had. Within a day of her death, strangers who never met her raised thousands of dollars for her girls. Her daughters faced the man who killed her and spoke for her. We say her name here so they don't have to carry that alone. And we would like to hear from you. People were told, in advance, in writing. What stops us from acting when we hear something like that, and what would it take to change it? Share your thoughts below. Case 4, Elizabeth Shea. From a hotel room, in the weeks before he killed her, Kenneth Shea sat with his phone and typed a question into a search engine. He wanted to know who gets the house when a wife dies. He was not idly curious, he was doing research. Her name was Elizabeth Shea. She was 57 years old, and she had built something with her own hands, a pet daycare in Winmore, Pennsylvania, called Lucky Dogs. It was hers, the business, the home on Cromwell Lane, the life. She had made all of it. Kenneth Shea was 37, 20 years younger, and he had come into her life through that business. She had hired him. That is how they met. She was the owner, he was the help. They grew close, they married, and for a time they shared the home she owned. But by early 2024, Elizabeth had seen enough to know she needed him gone. In January, he assaulted her. He strangled her. Police were called to the house. And Elizabeth did what the experts beg people in her position to do. She acted. On March 15th, she filed a protection from abuse order against him, and she had him evicted from her home. She did everything right. She recognized the danger. She named it to the court. She created a paper record, and she put physical distance between herself and the man who had put his hands around her throat. And it is one of the hardest truths in this entire subject that doing everything right is sometimes not enough, because the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is not the violence you live inside. It is the moment you leave. Evicted and living in a hotel, Kenneth Shea did not let go. He searched the internet for what he stood to gain from her death, and then he made a plan. Just after midnight on April 10th, 2024, he ordered an Uber. It carried him from his hotel to the home he had been forced to leave, the home that was hers. He did not have a key anymore, so he forced his way in, pushing a window-mounted air conditioning unit into the house to open a path through the window. Inside, he killed her. Then he tried to erase it. Elizabeth's home was equipped with security cameras, a system that had recorded him. Kenneth gathered 4 hard drives from those recorders and 3 cell phones and submerged them in water, in the bathroom sink and the toilet, trying to drown the evidence of what he had done. He left, behind a locked door. He had made 2 mistakes. The cameras were one, the other was the car. The very Uber that carried him to her home created a digital record of exactly where he had gone and when. Elizabeth was found later that morning during a wellness check because she had not shown up to work at the business she loved, and the people there knew that was not like her. On June 10th, 2024, before Montgomery County Judge William Carpenter, Kenneth Shea pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Through his attorney, he framed the plea as a mercy to the family, a way to spare Elizabeth's youngest son a trial before he left for college. In court, in tears, he apologized and said his actions spoke for themselves. On that last point, he was correct. Here is our reading of this case, offered as interpretation and not as legal finding. We have watched 3 men in this episode reach for a story after the fact. A mutual decision, a blackout, a mercy. Kenneth Shea's story arrives dressed as remorse. But look at the sequence, because the sequence is the truth of it. He searched for what he would inherit before she died. He arranged transportation. He forced entry through a window. He killed her, and then he methodically gathered and drowned the recordings that would show what he had done. Every one of those is a deliberate act, requiring thought, taken in order. Remorse is what you feel about something that happened to you in a moment you could not control. This was not that, this was a project. And the tears at sentencing, whatever their sincerity, arrived only after every other option had closed, after the cameras, after the Uber records, after the evidence had already made a trial pointless. Now the lesson, and it is the most important one in this case, because Elizabeth did not miss a single warning. She saw all of them. She was strangled in January, and as we learned in another case tonight, surviving strangulation is one of the strongest predictors that a partner will later kill. She recognized the threat. She got a protection from abuse order. She had him evicted. She separated. And still he killed her, in the window of time right after she left. This is not a reason for despair, and it is not a reason to believe that leaving does not work, because leaving does work, more often than not, and staying carries its own grave dangers. But it is a reason to understand that the period immediately after separation is the most lethal one, and that a protective order is a piece of paper, not a wall. The weeks after someone leaves an abuser are precisely when they need the most protection, not the least. A safety plan, people who know the situation, changed locks, a place the abuser does not expect, and law enforcement that treats a violated order as the emergency it is. If someone you love is leaving an abusive partner, that is not the moment to relax because they finally got out. That is the moment to close ranks around them. Elizabeth Shea built a business, a home, and a life, and she was clear-eyed enough to see the danger she was in and brave enough to act on it. She deserved to have that be enough. Her sisters, in court, called the man who killed her a parasite who used her. Her son said she is still watching over them and that they intend to make her proud. She should be here to see it. We say her name so that the record of this case is not only the record of the man who ended her life, but of the woman who fought to save it. And we would like to hear from you. Elizabeth did everything she was supposed to do, and it was in the aftermath of doing it that she was most in danger. Knowing that, how do you think we should be protecting people in the weeks right after they leave? Share your thoughts in the comments. Case 5, Nancy Giles. In October of 2018, a mother in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, could not reach her daughter and refused to accept the silence. On October 14th, she reported Nancy missing. It would take 7 months to find her and nearly 6 years to answer for her. Her name was Nancy Giles. She was somebody's daughter, a daughter whose mother knew, immediately, that something was wrong and would not stop until the world knew it too. In May of 2019, a man walking the hillside below the Johnstown inclined plane with a metal detector found human remains in a shallow grave, about 2 feet down, along a sculpture trail. Dental records and a surgical implant confirmed it was Nancy. She had been there since the autumn before. A forensic team's examination found injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, and her death was ruled a homicide, though the remains had been in the ground so long that the exact object used to kill her might never be known. Suspicion settled closest to home on her husband, Brian Bradley Giles. And here is this case's particular shape. Giles did not tell one story that fell apart. He told many. Across a 3.5-year investigation, he gave detectives account after account, and the versions did not agree. One investigator put it precisely on the stand. The only consistent thing in the entire case was Brian's inconsistencies. A person telling the truth has one account because they are describing what happened. A person generating explanations on demand eventually contradicts himself, and Giles did, again and again, until the contradictions became their own evidence. There was more. A relative testified he had heard Giles threaten to kill Nancy and bury her in the woods, very nearly what happened to her. In June of 2024, a Cambria County jury deliberated about an hour before finding Brian Giles guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, as the judge prepared to impose the mandatory life term, he was openly belligerent, mocking her, cursing the prosecution and his own attorneys, until he was removed from the room. Outside, Nancy's mother said something simpler. "We got justice. It's a happy day for Nancy. She deserved for it to end there. It did not. The day after the conviction, acting on a tip, investigators searched the basement of Giles's former home. In under 3 hours, they found a second set of remains buried under the dirt floor, later identified as Jilly Todaro, a Johnstown woman and Giles's girlfriend, reported missing in 2020, while Nancy's case was still open. In the record of her disappearance was a letter, said to be hers, claiming she had left for a new life with someone else. We will be careful here. What is established is this: a woman went missing, a letter suggested she had chosen to vanish, and her remains were found buried in the home of a man already convicted of killing his wife. What happened to Jilly Todaro was, at the time Nancy's case closed, still under investigation, and we will not tell you more than the record supports. But the discovery reframed everything. The grave on the hillside was not the whole of it. Here is our reading of this case: interpretation, not legal finding. Every other story tonight was answered in weeks or months. Nancy's took nearly 6 years, and the only reason it was answered at all is that one person refused to let it go cold. Consider what that takes. A missing person case that stretches past a year grows less likely to be solved with each month. Attention fades, files sink. The world, gently and without malice, moves on. What did not move on was a mother who knew, on that October day, that her daughter would not simply disappear without a word, and who held that certainty through a body on a hillside, through years of shifting stories, through a trial, through a sentencing where the man responsible cursed the room rather than face her. That is the lesson worth carrying. The first 48 hours get the urgency, but it is the people still asking in year 3, still calling the detective, still refusing "we don't know" as an ending, who are the reason cases like this ever close. Persistence here is not a personality trait. It is an investigative force. Departments will tell you plainly, a family that stays engaged and keeps a case from going silent changes the odds it is ever solved. If someone you love goes missing, the hardest and most important thing you will ever do is refuse to let the world file them away. Peggy Singer did that for 6 years, and when it was over, she did not speak about the man at all. She spoke about her daughter. We got justice. It's a happy day for Nancy. She was right at the beginning, when others still hoped for an innocent explanation. She was right at the end. We say Nancy's name because her mother made sure the world would have to. Case 6, Mary Susan Barrett. For 2 days in January of 2021, Mary Barrett's friends and family messaged her, and Mary messaged back. She told them she was fine. She answered their questions. She was, as far as anyone reading those messages could tell, alive and well in her home in Plymouth, Pennsylvania. Mary Barrett had been dead since Saturday. The person typing was the man who killed her. Her name was Mary Susan Barrett. She was 43 years old, and the life behind that name was extraordinary. She grew up in Illinois, and she was a marksman, good enough, her father said, to have qualified for the Olympics in sharpshooting. She chose a different path. Straight out of high school, she enlisted in the United States Air Force. She served, was honorably discharged, and then, after September 11, 2001, she went back because, in her father's words, her country needed her. Those who loved her described someone free-spirited, someone who lived in the moment and saw the good in people. Her mother remembered her stopping in the middle of a 4-lane highway to rescue a cat. She volunteered at an animal shelter. And when she and her husband bought a historic home in the small borough of Plymouth, that house became her pride and joy, the thing she poured herself into. Plymouth would come to love her back. We know this because of what the town did after she was gone. On January 9, 2021, inside that home, Daniel Barrett killed his wife. He would later tell police how it began, an argument in which he accused Mary of being unfaithful. That accusation exists only in his account. It was his justification, not a finding of fact. What is not in dispute is what followed. He attacked her. It was not a single blow, and it was not over quickly. And when it was done, he carried her body down to the basement of the house she loved and left her there. Then he did the thing that tells us more about that night than anything else he said. He did not call for help. He did not confess. Instead, over that weekend, as Mary's family and friends reached out, Daniel Barrett picked up her phone and answered them as her. He sent texts in her name, including one to her own daughter, about the family dog. Ordinary words, a mother's small daily reassurance, typed by the man who had just killed her, to keep anyone from wondering why she had gone silent. On January 11th, he walked into the Plymouth police station and told officers he had killed his wife. That night, they found her. When he explained himself, he offered a familiar shape of a story. He remembered the argument. He remembered striking her. And then, he said, he blacked out, coming back to himself standing over her, with no memory of what had happened in between. On February 7th, 2022, before President Judge Michael T. Vogue of Luzerne County, Daniel Barrett pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The case had been prosecuted by the Pennsylvania Office of the Attorney General. First-degree murder in Pennsylvania carries a single sentence, and he received it, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge remarked that he customarily wishes departing defendants good luck. He would not be doing so in this case. Here is our reading of this case, offered as interpretation and not as legal finding. Consider that blackout, and consider what came after it. A genuine loss of awareness would end when the violence ended. It would not carry a body to a basement. It would not pick up a phone and compose 2 days of messages in the victim's voice, reading her family's worry and answering it, word by careful word, to keep them calm. That is not a mind that has gone blank. That is a mind working very hard and very deliberately to control what other people believe. But the piece worth lifting out is the impersonation itself, one of the quietest and most chilling tactics in this whole subject, and more common than people realize. When someone has harmed a person and needs time to clean, to flee, to decide, the most effective thing they can do is keep that person seeming alive. A text from the victim's phone, a cheerful message from their account, a "she's fine, she just needs space," passed to worried family. Each one buys hours, and hours are what the guilty need most. We have seen this exact move in other cases, in other states, a spouse typing as the person they killed to keep a search from beginning. It works because we trust the account. We see the familiar name, the little photo, and we relax. The message feels like the person. It is not the person. So here is what to carry from Mary's story. If someone you care about goes quiet, and the only thing answering you is a screen, and something feels even slightly off, do not let the reassurance settle you. A message is not proof of life. Ask for a voice. Ask to see them today. A person who is fine can pick up a phone. An account can be held by anyone, including the last person who should be. Mary Susan Barrett served her country twice, stopped traffic to save an animal, and loved her town enough that it created an award in her name. Her mother faced the man who killed her and told him her headstone would not bear his name. It doesn't. She is remembered as she lived, as Mary Bradley. And we would like to hear from you. For 2 days, the people who loved Mary were reassured by a voice that was not hers. What would it take to notice when the words are right, but the person is missing? Share your thoughts in the comments. Case 7, Jan Roseboro. When Michael Roseboro called 911 on the night of July 22, 2008, he was calm. That detail would matter later, because a man reporting that he has just pulled his wife's lifeless body from the bottom of a swimming pool does not usually sound calm. But Michael Roseboro was a funeral director. He had stood beside grief his entire professional life. He knew what it was supposed to look like. And on the phone that night, in the retelling investigators would return to again and again, the performance was not quite right. Her name was Jan Roseboro. She was 45 years old, the mother of 4 children, and, by the account of nearly everyone who knew her, a genuinely kind woman, the sort whose kindness her loved ones would later call her legacy. She and Michael had known each other since before they married in 1989. To their community in Lancaster County, they looked like the perfect family. Michael came from a name that meant something there, a funeral home his family had run for over a century. Behind that picture, Michael was living a second life. For months, he had been carrying on an affair with a married mother of 2 named Angela Funk, who lived near the funeral home. It was not a handful of stolen moments. Investigators would eventually recover hundreds of emails and text messages between them, and records of thousands of phone calls. On the night of July 22nd, Michael told police he had gone inside around 10 o'clock, leaving Jan by the pool, and fallen asleep. About an hour later, he said, he woke, noticed the outdoor lights still on, went to shut them off, and found Jan at the bottom of the deep end. A tragic accident. A strong swimmer who somehow drowned in her own backyard. The autopsy dismantled that story before it could take hold. Jan had not simply drowned, she had been beaten and strangled before she ever entered the water. Her death was ruled a homicide, caused by multiple traumatic injuries. The pool was not the scene of an accident. It was the place a body had been arranged to hide one. And then the physical evidence began to speak, in the way physical evidence does, quietly and without a motive to lie. Neighbors told police the pool's exterior lights, which normally switched on automatically at dusk, were off shortly after 10. Investigators came to believe Michael had turned them off deliberately to work in the dark. Near the pool, they found a bucket and a rag that smelled of cleaning fluid. The coroner noted that Jan's injuries would have caused substantial bleeding, and yet a forensic team could find no blood inside the house or out. Someone had cleaned. But the detail that ended it was the smallest one. In the last moments of her life, Jan Roseboro fought. She reached up and scratched her attacker's face. And when investigators examined her hands, they found skin beneath her fingernails, his, while Michael himself turned up with fresh scratches on his face. The DNA belonged to her husband. As the district attorney put it, the last act of Jan's life was to leave a record of who killed her. In July of 2009, after a lengthy trial, a jury deliberated about 5 hours before finding Michael Roseboro guilty of first-degree murder. That September, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. To this day, he maintains his innocence. Here is our reading of this case, offered as interpretation and not as legal finding. Every man in this episode built a story. Michael Roseboro built a stage. He did not offer an explanation after the fact. He tried to arrange the facts themselves, in advance, so that no crime would ever be suspected. An accident needs no alibi. That was the point. If Jan had simply drowned, there would be no murder to explain, no suspect to name, no affair to uncover. The staging was not a lie told to investigators. It was an attempt to make sure investigators never came. And notice who attempted it. Not a career criminal, a respected professional, a man who buried other people's loved ones for a living, who understood, better than most, exactly what a natural death is supposed to look like. That is the unsettling truth at the center of this case. The capacity to do this is not confined to the obviously dangerous. It can wear a suit, run a family business, and know precisely which lights to turn off. The lesson here is about what a staged scene cannot control. Roseboro could turn off the lights. He could wipe away the blood. He could steady his voice on the phone. But he could not reach under his wife's fingernails. He could not talk the autopsy out of its findings. He could not make the physical world agree to his story. A performance can fool the people in the room. It cannot fool the evidence, because the evidence was never watching the performance. It was recording what actually happened. And there is a quieter lesson for anyone who has ever felt foolish for a flicker of doubt about how someone reacted to a death. Investigators did not crack this case because of the DNA alone. They started pulling the thread because something about that calm 911 call did not sit right. Instinct is not proof, but instinct that something is off is often the first thing that leads, eventually, to the thing that is. Jan Roseboro was 45 years old, a mother of 4, remembered for a kindness that outlived the man who ended it. She fought for her life, and in fighting, she named her killer. We say her name because she earned, in her last moments, the truth that this case finally told. And we would like to hear from you. This killer's whole plan depended on one thing, that a death would be accepted as an accident, and no one would look closer. What do you think it is that makes us look closer, or look away? Share your thoughts in the comments. Case 8, Karen Leclair. On June 11, 2017, the United States Coast Guard launched an emergency search over the waters of Lake Erie. A woman had gone into the lake. Her husband had called it in himself. His wife, he said, had fallen overboard from their fishing boat. For days, rescuers scoured the water, racing against time to find a woman who might still be alive. She was already gone. And the man who sent them searching knew exactly where she was, because he was the one who had put her there. Her name was Karen Leclair. She was 51 years old, and she had been married to Christopher for nearly 26 years. Almost her entire adult life had been spent beside this man in the small community of Albion, Pennsylvania. 26 years is not a chapter, it is the book. It is the person you built everything with. Christopher Leclair was a commercial fisherman. The boat was called the Doris M. And by the summer of 2017, Christopher was living a life Karen may not have fully known. He was involved with another woman, and prosecutors would later say that woman had given him an ultimatum: choose her or his wife. He made his choice. But instead of ending a 26-year marriage the way it is meant to be ended, with papers, with honesty, with a door closing, he decided his wife should simply disappear. On June 10th, the day before the frantic call to the Coast Guard, dock surveillance cameras recorded the couple leaving together on the Doris M. Those same cameras recorded Christopher returning, hours later, alone. The next day, he took the boat out by himself and radioed for help. Karen, he said, had been feeling seasick, had sat down on the edge of the boat, and when he looked over, she was gone. An accident, a tragic slip into open water. Nearly a month later, on July 4th, a boater off the coast of Dunkirk, New York, found Karen's body. She had not slipped, and she had not simply fallen. She had been fatally wounded, bound, and weighted with an anchor so that she would never surface. This was not an accident, it was a disposal, dressed as one. And the story unraveled from every direction at once. The dock video had already contradicted his account. They left together, he came back alone, a full day before he claimed she vanished. Border Patrol radar showed his boat had never traveled more than about 4 miles from shore, collapsing the picture of a distant, deep-water tragedy. And then came the detail that revealed this was no sudden act. Investigators presented testimony that, on several occasions before her death, Christopher Leclair had told people he knew of a plan to kill his wife and drop her body into Lake Erie. He had described it, in advance, to more than one person. And then he had done very nearly exactly that. At trial in October of 2018, his defense offered a final, startling claim that Karen, distraught over his affair, had taken her own life aboard the boat, and that Christopher had hidden her body only out of guilt and shame. The prosecution called it what it was, a desperate story, inconsistent with all of the evidence. The jury agreed. They deliberated for under 2 hours before finding Christopher Leclair guilty of first-degree murder, along with abuse of a corpse, tampering with evidence, and filing false reports. That December, the judge imposed the mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, and added years more for the other crimes. He also ordered Leclair to repay more than $700,000, the cost of the Coast Guard search he had sent out to look for a woman he had already killed. The judge said the calculation and depravity of the crime were unlike almost anything he had seen in his years on the bench. And even from a jail cell, he kept trying. In a recorded phone call, Christopher asked his elderly father a question: had the police found the gun, and told him to make it vanish. His father, then 77, moved the weapon and hid it, of all places, back inside the home Christopher had shared with Karen. Investigators found it there anyway. The father later pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence. And that recorded call became one more piece of the record, a man still trying to bury the truth, on a line that was quietly writing it all down. Here is our reading of this case, offered as interpretation and not as legal finding. Every man in this episode tried to control the story after the act. Christopher Leclair went one step further than any of them. He did not merely stage a scene, or offer an explanation, or wear his wife's voice for a day. He staged a rescue. He picked up the radio and summoned real people, Coast Guard crews, boats, aircraft, and sent them out over open water to search, urgently and in good faith, for a woman he knew was already at the bottom of the lake, anchored where no one would find her. Think about the coldness that requires. To perform grief is one thing, to manufacture an emergency, to make strangers risk their own safety chasing a lie you built, is another order entirely. And it points to something worth understanding about this kind of killer. The staged accident is not only an attempt to escape punishment, it is an attempt to be seen, publicly, as the victim of the tragedy rather than its author. The grieving husband, the man whose wife was lost to the water. He did not just want to get away with it, he wanted sympathy for it. But here is the lesson, and it is the one this case teaches better than any other. A false emergency is one of the easiest lies to disprove, because the moment you raise an alarm, you invite the world to look. The Coast Guard came, investigators came, cameras were checked, radar was pulled, and the timeline he invented could not survive the timeline the machines had quietly recorded. The very act of calling for help created the record that convicted him. And there is a warning in the earlier part of this story that we should not walk past. He told people, beforehand, what he intended to do. The plan was spoken aloud before it was ever carried out, and, as so often happens, it was not taken literally until it was too late. If someone describes to you, even once, even in a way that seems unthinkable, a specific plan to harm their partner, that is not dark venting. That is a person telling you who they are while they still can. Karen Leclair gave 26 years to the man who ended her life and then called for help he knew would find nothing. She deserved to have those years honored, not erased beneath an anchor and a lie. Her body surfaced on the 4th of July, and in surfacing, she began the process that would tell the truth her husband had tried to sink. We say her name because the lake gave her back, and so should we. And we would like to hear from you. This killer's plan depended on being believed as a grieving husband, even as he sent rescuers chasing a lie. What do you think it is that finally makes a performance like that fall apart? Share your thoughts in the comments. 8 Pennsylvania marriages, 8 women who should still be here, and 8 men who thought a good enough story could bury the truth. A blackout, a staged accident, a voice borrowed from the dead, a rescue that was never real. Every one of them failed for the same reason. The lie was told to people, but the truth had been recorded by things. A camera, a phone, a timeline, an anchor, skin beneath a fingernail. The evidence was never listening to the performance. It was only keeping the record. But if you take one thing from tonight, let it be this. In case after case, the danger was spoken or sensed before it ever arrived. A threat said out loud, a silence that felt wrong, a person who stopped being themselves. The warning is almost always there. What it needs is someone willing to take it seriously. Deborah, Nicole, Jami, Elizabeth, Nancy, Mary, Jan, Karen. 8 names and 8 lives that were far more than the way they ended. We said them tonight so they would be remembered as they lived. If someone you love is in danger, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is there, confidential and always open. You'll find it below. And if one of these stories stayed with you, tell us in the comments which one and why. We read them. Thank you for sitting with these women's stories. We'll see you next time.